I'm here today with Daniel Chua, professor of music at the University of Hong Kong. We're here in New Haven at Yale today for a conversation about the theology of joy. Daniel, so glad to have you here with us.
Oh, thank you.
You know, as long as we've been at this project, and we've been at this a little while now, we still find that we kind of have to start at the beginning, asking questions like, what is joy? And as a musicologist, you bring a particular kind of angle to this. So let me ask you, what is joy, or what ought joy be?
What ought joy be like? Well, from my point of view, I mean, if we're talking about Christian joy, which is, I think, quite different from other forms of joy, I think joy is fundamentally about a relationship with God. It has to be rooted in that relationship. And it's both, in one sense, what I would call a steady state, a kind of disposition of joy, because it's founded on a really strong narrative of what God has done in creation, in salvation, and redemption. And on the other hand, it's also a very strong, spontaneous emotion, like music. It has to have that effect. Otherwise, it's not a real sense of joy. So I also think that joy is something that is an immediate expression. And I like to see it as an expression that responds to times when we see something in creation or in redemption or in salvation that suddenly makes sense to us, and we sort of, excited about it, and then we sort of go, wow, that's really cool. So that's my sense of joy, both a steady state and also a spontaneous reaction. But I don't think we could be spontaneously reacting emotionally with joy all the time, because that would mean that we are in a constant state of satisfaction, which I don't think is the case in our lives.
So you say that joy is a fruit, not a root, that it is the result of something in particular.
Yes, I mean, I feel that people tend to isolate joy, particularly in sort of modern enlightened concepts, as a goal in itself. Whereas for me, joy is something that has to be rooted in love, in faith, in hope. It's a kind of product of that. It's not itself a primary principle. Because if you make it into a primary principle, I think it'll have a very deracinated and desiccated feel to it, because basically it loses its moral bearings in things that are permanent. And also as a fruit, actually, it needs to be seen as part of the fruit of the Spirit. So it has to be with other virtues, as it were, with patience and goodness and self-control. So it's really a process of sanctification. It's part of that process. But it also is a gift that comes from the Holy Spirit. And if you then take that joy out of the fruit, as it were, giving to somebody a pip or a pith or the pulp of an orange, then again joy would be seriously impoverished outside that context.
But you say that there's a kind of damaged modern joy that's attempted to do something just like that.
Yes.
How would you describe this damaged modern joy?
I see modern joy as a kind of declaration of independence, that joy wants to be itself. And I think we often rebrand that as happiness. So the pursuit of happiness. In other words, our goal is to pursue joy for itself. So it's like enjoying joy. But the problem with enjoying joy is that it's a tautology, and so all tautologies are in the end kind of empty and in fact abstract. So if you have a kind of empty abstract goal to which you have a desire for, then I think it's a very serious problem if that's your moral teleology, as it were.
So you actually describe it in terms of a kind of parody of the Westminster Catechism, rather than
That's right.
rather than enjoying God. Our chief end of man is to
enjoy joy instead of enjoying God, which seems very problematic to me.
Yeah, good. You actually describe the way in your paper that you prepared for today's conversation. The way you describe this modern joy is you describe it in terms of what you find reflected in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
Yes.
How is Beethoven's Ninth? This is a beloved piece of music, and you hold it up as, in some ways, kind of reflective of these kinds of damaged pictures of joy.
Well, all great music has something to say about our condition. So it's not really an indictment of great music. It's more a question of why do we keep playing this? Like, why does it mean so much to us? So, Fall of the Berlin Wall, Leonard Bernstein plays the Ninth Symphony to celebrate joyfully freedom. fall of the Twin Towers in New York, freedom, life, happiness, all threatened, you still play Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to speak of the resilience of the human spirit. So that work really taps into our sense of who we are, our values, our fundamental values as modern human beings. So my question is, well, what kind of joy is being represented in that piece? Why does it speak so powerfully to us? And most of the time we don't really think about it. We just let the music have an effect on us. But if you begin to think carefully about the Ninth Symphony and what it's trying to say, then it has some very curious things to say about what modern joy is like. I mean, for a start, it's about actually a pursuit of happiness, because the whole structure of the Ninth Symphony is from this kind of nothingness to this society or this brotherhood of joy. So it's something about manufacturing joy as the goal of society. And secondly, I would say that it's about power, because the world in the Ninth Symphony is construed as a kind of violent place in which you have to assert joy. So joy is asserted as a kind of powerful force that overcomes the world, as it were. It's a very Enlightenment sense of overcoming. And then because it's this kind of overpowering, overcoming sense of joy, it's very much within Beethoven's heroic tradition. And if you think about heroic virtues, actually they're intimately tied with the idea of sacrificial death and with tragedy and with fate. So actually this joy is not that joyful in the end. I mean, really, it's a pledge to have a kind of battle, a kind of victory, in order to to save your community, and you are the hero. And this joyful act of heroism is really no better than a kind of this dicing with death, really. And of course, in the end, you are supposed to die so that you can be immortalized, and then you have this great funereal celebration, which are joyful, but somebody's dead, in that celebration. So there are very problematic elements to it. And if you listen to the symphony carefully, you will hear that it's actually quite violent, and it's about the speed of being able to have that exhilaration, excitement of joy. And it's talking about how we should gather together in this kind of stampede towards victory at the end. And it has a lot of problematic elements. I find it very interesting that it's often associated with violence. So the Clockwork Orange, for example, with Beethoven's Ninth, is associated with gratuitous violence. But there are also other less sort of profound pieces of work that also associate violence with Beethoven's Ninth. So I think there was a movie, Get Smart, where I think the Walt Disney Concert Hall was about to be blown up with a performance of Beethoven's Ninth that would trigger this bomb when it hit this particularly high note. That's one thing. And Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy actually portrays Beethoven's Ninth as this kind of orgiastic finale before this rather grim will, which and everybody, of course, is about to be annihilated, but you accept that fate, accept that tragedy. So there is this tradition about the Ninth Symphony, which is actually quite dark.
One of the things you pick up there, and you just talked about it a bit, is this kind of agonistic nature of the piece, that it's about a heroic overcoming, but that means there has to be an enemy that needs to be overcome. You say that heroic joy is always based on threat, requiring a prior evil to react against in order to celebrate a virtue that merely replicates the evil that it resists. In previous consultations, we've talked about the possibility of toxic joy, of rejoicing in wrongdoing, which Paul says love does not do.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about? Is this modern joy a toxic joy of a certain sort?
Yes, I think it's a kind of inadvertent toxic joy, because you are trying in one sense to overcome evil, but you simply replicate that because you are reacting with the same kind of power or force. And so you sort of begin to reflect the very evil that you resist. And so you're within that same cycle. And that this happens quite often, actually, when we think we are actually doing something good, but it's actually just a replication of evil.
Miroslav Volf describes this in terms of the way that the oppressed can end up being kind of formed in the image of the oppressor, precisely in their resistance, if it's conceived of wrongly and in this kind of agonistic sort of way.
That's right.
Another another element that you talk about with the Ninth Symphony is you pick up on speed. You say, and of course, you mean quite literally, I suppose, tempo in the music. But it also made me think a lot about modern life. We do have an obsession in the modern world with speed. We want our life to go faster. We find our computers intolerably slow, even though they're millions of times faster than the computers that put men on the moon. Is this a connection that you would draw? Are we less likely to find joy the more we live at an unsustainably kind of speed-obsessed pace?
I think actually joy, in one sense, is the kind of pure sense of that kind of speed that you were thinking about. Because let's imagine that you were driving very fast in a Ferrari. Okay, I mean, that is a very joyful image. It's a very free image. And it's that sense of speed as power and exhilaration, that you are in this vehicle, which is a kind of prosthetic extension of who you are, and that you just have this infinite power to overcome. And it's about that speed. It's always a kind of roller coaster ride, and it's the same sense in which you're also dicing with danger at the same time. It's that kind of joy that I'm talking about. And it's a joy that has no purpose, because you just enjoy that exhilaration, that sense that you are speeding. So you're going nowhere fast, but it's great, right? And so these kind of, I suppose, kind of cheap thrill, really, is to me a very modern sense of joy. But as I say in my paper, actually that kind of speed also kills, because in the end, it's actually about dicing with death.
And so we often find, I think, in life that when we pursue kind of deeper joy, it involves, well, the Bible talks about Sabbath.
That's
and
right.
Rest, right? And
it's the complete opposite, exactly. Where you don't actually have to be in this kind of pure sense of movement, where you can, in fact, be at rest. I think it's probably to do with music replicating a sense of the movement of the will. And so when music moves very fast, we have this sort of exhilaration that we're moving very, very fast with it. And we forget that actually that sense of joy is not necessarily the only sense of joy in the world, and there is a contemplative relationship that can be at rest with God.
Yeah, the music in that sense is replicating what we have in our broader culture in terms of a desire being the kind of engine of progress, right?
Yes,
that we have this unfulfilled desire that keeps driving us further and further forward.
And of course, Beethoven's perfect at that sort of great kind of teleological drive, right?
I was speaking with economists earlier in this project that saw that connection with joy. One other piece that you pick up on is you say that the kind of joy that we find in the Ninth Symphony is a joy that necessarily has to do with exclusion. There has to be an overcoming here, and that means someone's on the outs. That seems to contrast quite starkly with biblical images that are constantly talking about enter into my joy, make my joy complete. There's the sharing of joy, and it's quite ironic in the Ninth Symphony where it is about brotherhood and this formation of this community, but you say ultimately it's exclusionary.
That's right. I mean, it is extremely ironic that when you make joy your principle, that means that the only people that can join that society are people that are joyful. And the text actually makes it very explicit. It's it says that okay, everybody's happy, having a good time, but let those who cannot rejoice steal weeping away. Right, so it deliberately excludes those who cannot fit into the group. There has to be an excluded other. So because this kind of joy doesn't really can't handle suffering. Let's put it that way. It can't handle the kind of biblical sense in which you can rejoice even if things are not necessarily going that well in your life, because there's something greater. This kind of joy really is, well, if you can't join in, you're out.
Wow. So different than Rabbi Nachman tells a story about, he says, joy overcoming depression is the case that he's talking about. Joy overcoming depression is like a group of people dancing and kind of grab the glum fellow from the corner and invite him in, and now all of a sudden he's caught up in their dance.
Yes.
Quite different approach than the you're glum, so. Get out of the room.
Yeah, because this is about a victory parade, and we've won and you haven't.
Yeah. Huh. You contrast your account of Beethoven in some senses with Karl Barth's account of Mozart.
Yes,
Barth is fascinated by Mozart.
Yes, I wanted something a bit more positive. Actually, Beethoven has, I should mention this, another side to him that is much more tender, and actually I think he does speak to joy. But I think I was looking at Karl Barth's infatuation actually with Mozart and what he was writing about. It seemed to me that this is Barth at his most joyful, and he's describing Mozart in terms of joy, and I thought that it would be a very good contrast to what I was talking about in the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And it's to do actually not with a particular work, but it's just Mozart and his music in general, and how that music somehow is able to encapsulate the sense of what I described earlier as Christian joy. In other words, there's a sense in which creation is totally good. Right? So there's that sense of providential nature of God is being expressed somehow through creation, and there's a sense in which there is peace. And even though there are shadows to this music, it's very much within that context of that goodness. And as Karl Barth says, and this is in the context of the Lisbon earthquake that sort of shook not only Lisbon but everybody in that period. So this is almost a kind of rebuttal of that kind of questioning of God's providential care that he hears in Mozart's music.
Does it run the risk of being what I suppose, perhaps ironically, we would say is maybe tone deaf, right? Is it aloof? Is Mozart's music then aloof from the suffering of the world? I mean, this seems to be a danger, right? The kind of naive politics of just contentment rather than kind of engaged activist kind of politics.
Well, I think in Barth's reading, it's not aloof in the sense that he does deal with these the shadow side, as he calls it, but it never overcomes the music. In other words, there's a sense in which the music always speaks of the total goodness of God, despite or even because of all the darker elements. And he talks particularly about the G minor symphony, which is one of the more tragic symphonies. But of course, he's picking up on Mozart's own comments that he doesn't go for the completely dark thing, because music is not like that in the end. And so there's something about the form in Mozart's music and the way he's able to present all this wonderful variety of ideas that sort of percolate through in a way where everything seems to make sense, right? That for Barth so speaks of that kind of providential nature of God.
And so in that sense, then the joy that Mozart's talking about can be kind of context independent in a certain way. There's something steady and foundational.
Yes. I mean, formally, if I'm going to speak as a music analyst, formally the music, you can say, is a kind of steady state. The form really holds everything together. But the curious thing about Mozart is there's just so much happening. How do you manage to hold so much together, right? So there is a sense in which there is, if you like, let's just call it an invisible will or purpose that is holding the music together in this extraordinary way. And at the same time, there's room for contingency. I think the one thing, I didn't write about this, but is that in Mozart, there's always this sense of being surprised by joy. Really, the moments where, for no reason, there'll be this new theme that just comes in and it just makes everybody smile, and it's usually very comedic, not in the sense that it's sort of slapstick humor, but in the sense that it's usually opera buffa or something that sort of comes in, and you go, wow, that was just pure gratuity. It was not necessary, but it is absolutely delightful. And I think there is that element of joy as this kind of spontaneous expression that also happens in Mozart. So it has the steady state, and it has this spontaneous emotional outpouring.
There's an element of play that you talk about.
Yes, for Barth that's really important, that Mozart just plays. And I think by that he means that Mozart is not trying to deal with great themes. He's not trying to make any theological point. He's just playing with notes, playing with the music. And in doing that as music, he's able to express something that, as far as Barth is concerned, even some of the greatest theologians in all traditions cannot express about the nature of God.
So then let me ask you finally, if we have this picture of joy and we can describe it, it's about relationship with God, part of an integrated whole life as a kind of foundation of relatedness to God, and yet this kind of spontaneity and openness and playfulness, openness to the world in that way. how do we can describe it, how do we cultivate it? We would all like to experience more joy in our lives, in our families, in our communities. How do we cultivate joy?
Cultivation is a very interesting word because, in a way, if you go back to, say, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, basically human beings were not born in nature, they were already born in culture. It was really a garden, and their job was to cultivate, right? Mm-hmm. So in a way you could say that already in that Edenic state there was a kind of cultivation of joy that was taking place in relation with God, but also with the world, right? And so I think one way of cultivating joy is just to cultivate your relationship with the world, with God, and with one another in ways where you are attentive to these details that you want to cultivate something so that you value it, right? That's what you do when you cultivate. It could be anything. It could be a rose. It could be a wild rose, and you cultivate that so you see the beauty of that rose. But you've put your human value on it, as well as your relationship, as it were, with the world and with God. So to me, when you said cultivate, it brings to mind that idea where you live in a way where you begin to bring beauty to the things that you observe and see in your relationships that you actually have.
And so then you experience joy then as a fruit.
Yes, literally a fruit, right?
Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
Okay. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to more conversation this afternoon and tomorrow. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.